Tony Abbott this week held the first ever National Flag Day at a Parliament House with soldiers, political leaders, children and, of course, the national flag. This is one more small step as an attempt in his first year to bring back more traditional ceremonies and awards like Knights and Dames, like a soldier as Governor-General. To talk about what he's achieved in his first year and where he's failed, I'm joined by Bruce Hawker, the former Labor campaign strategist, and Michael Kroger, the former Victorian Liberal president. So how has he changed things, Bruce? I mean, flags, Knights, Dames, taking on Russia, sending in the RAAF to the Middle East. There seems to be a theme to this. Well,
internationally, I think he has changed things, clearly, and or he's responded to the deterioration in both Ukraine and in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely true, and I think the public is giving him recognition and support for that proposition. Where I don't think he has really changed things, interestingly, is on the economy as yet, because he can't get his budget through. If he were to achieve some of the things he wanted to get out of his budget, then I think he would be changing Australia fundamentally. But I'm not sure that there's a real appetite either in the Parliament or in the public for some of the things that he wants to do. So that's why I suspect he's moving more now to the international stage, to some of the more traditional things like the flag and the monarchy and so forth. Not that I think that the dames and knighthoods was a particularly popular thing with the election.
But it's part of a pattern. It seems to be part of a pattern, Michael, where he's trying to put a more conservative cast on the national debate. I think bit by bit that might be working. The Knights and Dames got laughed at, but bit by bit that might be coming through.
Well, of course, tradition's not newsworthy. If you get a family's conference and tip a bucket of red paint over yourself, that gets on the news. But talking about the Australian flag isn't something for the television cameras. So you've got to keep repeating those events and keep publicising them to keep reminding people of them. But you dissect the government this way, I think. Those ministers that have had to deal with Clive Palmer and those that haven't. So who hasn't? Scott Morrison. When Morrison's been able to do his own thing with the government, extraordinary success. The greatest success of the government, by the way, saving people's lives. That's the one great, above all else, I consider that to be the success of the government. Julie Bishop, enough said. Tony Abbott on the foreign stage. Free trade, etc. Carbon and mining taxes, they got through, but like pulling teeth at the dentist. Those ministers that have had to deal with the Senate, Hockey, Pyne, Dutton, far more difficult.
That said, I would have thought after this week, the deal with Clive Palmer, where they at least got $10 billion of their savings through, $6 billion fell by the wayside, and they got the repeal of the mining tax, I think putting it in context, that leaves them celebrating the first anniversary thinking they're ahead.
Yeah, I don't think you can really make that claim, given that the opinion polls, for a start, don't reflect that. I think he's had a bad year on the domestic economic front.
No, except the opinion polls, but I'm saying in terms of now going ahead to fight it, they can say we've ticked off the big items of our promises, we've got some of the budget things through, we can make a deal with Clive Palmer after all. On we go.
Yeah, well, I think he can do deals with Palmer, but at a price, as we saw this week with the superannuation and the kids' bonus and so forth. So there's no doubt that Palmer is there to do deals, but these unheralded changes which he announced in the budget, which weren't part of the campaign, cuts to education, health, raising the pension and so forth, they are the things which I think the public are still very nervous about, because if he'd done one or two of those things, I think the electorate would have probably felt, OK, well, that's a part of a legitimate mandate for a government. But when you added them all up, it really alienated a lot of people out in the electorate, and I think they've still got to do a lot of work in that space.
I think there is a trust deficit there. Michael, looking back at the year, I mean, they'll be doing a little stock take. What will they have learned from the last year that they will say, well, we're not going to repeat that in the next two?
Look, very hard question. Obviously now they understand that Palmer is incredibly difficult to deal with, and anything that needs to go through the Senate is just a minefield. So anything they do that doesn't need Senate approval, they're probably going to concentrate more on, which is what your point was about foreign policy. But look, in the end, it raises big questions, bigger questions than just the current situation, which is, can Australia afford to be governed like this? To have Senate by roulette wheel? You go and talk to this fellow, he wants a big fund to help businesses in trouble. Well, what an absurd, laughable idea that is. It's contrary to all the free market principles that the Western world operates on. It's contrary to all the principles that this government is trying to inculcate into the community, that we don't have money for corporate warfare, etc., etc. So it raises the bigger question. Do we need the Australian Senate going forward? That's the biggest
I'm wondering
question.
about
That's an
that
interesting question.
And I've always supported it, but look at it now. What
It's almost like a futile debate, and you know it never will get through. But I do wonder, what is the Senate for now, given you've got this roulette wheel of... No one knows from before an election which of some of these members could ever possibly get a vote, you know, with the way the preference flows.
Absolutely. I mean, that's laughable. Well, it would be laughable if it wasn't so serious. You know, the next term we'll probably have the pigeon fanciers party holding the balance of power. You know, who knows?
You laugh, but I mean, it could just as easily happen.
It could happen, and it started happening in New South Wales, you know, a decade or more ago, and it's just spilled over into the federal sphere. I mean, certainly the Senate really ceased to be a state's house, you know, years ago, if it ever really was. I mean, people like Harradine probably took that seriously, but as a general proposition, it's only ever really been a break, I guess, on the lower house. And, you know my view about budgets and the like, Andrew. I think if you've got a majority in the lower house, you should actually be allowed to implement it. A very unpopular concept, you know, amongst a lot of progressive people, because they see that this would damage people. But I think a government should be judged on what it introduces and what it wants to do in the lower house.
But that goes to the point, I think, seeing the Senate's going to stay there, I think one thing the government will conclude from the last year is that the less it puts up to the Senate that's likely to get knocked back, the better. So it will be less ambitious for anything that requires legislation, but that can be, you know, gone through without getting the Senate's approval. That's what they're going to go for.
And therein lies the great problem, because if you want to look at the central problem that we have in the country today, it's the budgetary situation and the ongoing debt level, and that requires...
That's the pity.
That requires the Senate. So we actually need a national debate. You're absolutely right. This is no longer the state's house. It hasn't been for the entirety of my lifetime, except Harradine and one or two others. But look, you can't have a modern democracy like Australia governed basically at the whim of Clive Palmer. I mean, this is an absurdity, and he's the current, you know, manifestation of these lunatic, selfish, cold-hearted Greens who've been running the joint for the last decade. I mean, what kind of country can be run by... Just imagine if the American Congress was held to ransom by, you know,
by
Christine
people that
Milne,
want little votes for their constituency.
Or Clive Palmer.
It is. That's the problem.
Can I just say this, you know, one
They're
thing,
just not called Greens.
You could still have a system where you had a Senate, but had provision for many more joint sittings of the Parliament.
Yeah.
And that would, I think, be a good deadlock resolution mechanism.
Yep.
That's one of the problems we have in Australia. We really can't have a decent deadlock resolution.
That's a great alternative, actually. It's
Look, we'll be back with more from the panel after the break. We'll look particularly at Clive Palmer, who votes for 2 more changes that should help his business. How will the Abbott government go to get Clive Palmer's support in the Senate? He this week agreed to at least investigate his idea for a national fund to bail out troubled businesses. Palmer demanded that as a price for his senators' vote to scrap the mining tax. Opposition leader Bill Shorten was rightly scathing.
They are now encouraging a parliamentary inquiry into creating a Palmer piggy bank. This is crazy economics.
I'm back with Bruce Hawker and Michael Kroger. Bill Shorten is absolutely right.
Yes, he is.
Why has the government agreed to look at this idea to bail out troubled businesses, which, by the way, Michael, could conceivably include Palmer's own nickel refinery, which is losing money, and his Coolum resort, which is basically deserted?
Well, if you read Hedley Thomas's articles in The Australian, you might well conclude that there's a fair bit of truth in that. But what else is the government to do, Andrew? What else is the government to do? This fellow controls the Senate. He controls the future of the nation at the minute through the electoral system. That's what people voted for. So you either pretend the election didn't happen and just pull up stumps, or you have to deal with him. So you have to deal with him. There is no choice for the government.
I think then the scrutiny then must go on the media for not calling him out. Bruce, this is astonishing. You try and think of someone else that would have got away with this record. Have a look. Palmer voted for scrapping the mining tax. He's a miner, so that helped him. He's voted for scrapping the carbon tax. He has a nickel refinery, so that saved him $6 million a year, maybe. He's approved a delay to the rise in the compulsory superannuation. That was part of this week's deal. He's a boss, so that's a third win. On it goes. Is this an abuse of his political power?
I guess it's what happens when you get a billionaire in Parliament and basically buying a lot of political support through their ability to spend countless amounts of money campaigning to get their people up. So, I hope that he makes a declaration before every time he votes on these issues, because if you do have a pecuniary interest in a vote, then you should be making that declaration up front so people know. Look, the problem, of course, is that in the past, minor parties have held the balance of power in the Senate, and they've always been in a capacity to do, deals with them because they seem to have a very clear and consistent position, whether it be the Democrats or whatever.
I just described the clear and consistent position. If it helps Clive, it seems to get through.
Well, that may be part of it, but I think he jumps all over the place, and this, of course, creates huge problems for the government. And I think you do actually have to sup with the devil sometimes if you want to get your legislative program through, and that's the problem that the government's got. But it's a problem that previous governments have had as well. I just think with him, it's such an extreme iteration of controlling the Senate that people are now starting to step back and say, "Wow, what does this really mean for the way in which we're governed?"
Bill Shorten. Has this deal with Clive Palmer, where the government's got a fair bit of its legislation through now of the budget, has it sort of exposed Shorten? Like, is said no to everything, now sort of committed to what? Is he, all the cuts that have gone through, is he going to bring them back? Is he going to bring back the superannuation guarantee rises on schedule?
Look, a first-term opposition to win government has to define itself in some way. So Shorten has played political rulebook 101, oppose everything. Abbott did that, but of course he had the carbon tax he was opposed to, the mining tax he was opposed to.
It was good policy.
It was very good policy.
Yeah.
Abbott had some definition. Bill Shorten's got no definition at all as opposition leader. So his problem is that the closer they get to the election, Andrew, sooner or later, Shorten's going to have to come out with some A-grade policies to distinguish himself from the government. None of those can involve any expenditure, because the electorate will laugh at him. If he promises any billion-dollar schemes like you're most used to on a daily basis, Shorten will get laughed at. So Shorten will need some very substantive policies unrelated to spending, and it's going to be hard for him.
See, this is the difference, Bruce, because Abbott was saying no to things that, when he was then in government, he followed through on, like no to the carbon tax. He scrapped the carbon tax. What's Shorten going to do? He said no to scrapping all this savings. What, is he going to bring them back?
I think one thing he's definitely going to do is do away with the paid parental leave scheme, if that ever sees the light of day. And there's $22 billion in that. Look, I think they are going to have
sure, actually, Bruce. Look, so imagine a paid parental leave scheme does get through some form of it. It'll be cut back from what it's been cut back already. What, is he then going to go to an election and tell the women of Australia, I'm going to cut back this
Labor has a paid parental leave scheme, and it's one which most people think is affordable. And I think he'll go to the election on that. Look, he will have to make some hard calls, but what he will be able to say is that, this was a government that didn't say anything about changes to health, education, pensions, and we're not going to be a government that is going to surprise you at the first budget. So
I've heard that pitch before.
Well, he can do that with great legitimacy now, because that's exactly what Hawker and Abbott did with their first budget. And I think, the interesting thing, I think, down the line is going to be, what is the end game in all this? Is the answer going to be a new tax, or is it going to be increasing the GST or the ambit of the GST? Because something has to give. Either you live with less, or we have a taxation system which allows us to afford at least some of the things that we have at the moment.
Big call for Shorten to face, I think, in particular. Iraq, the government says it's waiting for a formal request to send over RAAF jets for US-led attacks on the Islamic State. Here's the Foreign Minister.
The countries that have expressed a willingness to tackle ISIL head-on have also looked at what more can be done in terms of airstrikes, and Australia will respond when a formal request is made.
Anything controversial in this?
Nothing at all. And if the government is asked to supply troops to help save lives in Iraq, it should do so. Bill Clinton said in his autobiography that one of the biggest regrets of his presidency was that in the 1994 massacre in Rwanda, when out of a population of 8 million, 800,000 people, 10% of the population were macheted to death, he did nothing. Now, here's a situation. This will haunt the Western world forever if it does not save the lives of people who are being shot in the head, butchered to death, if it stands by and done nothing.
Why is this such a hard issue for the Greens then?
Well, look, I don't pretend to answer for the Greens, Andrew, and I never will. But I agree. I think when you see the brutality that and in the 7th century mindset of ISIL, what can you do? The civilised world has to respond, and they have to respond under appropriate leadership from the United States. And I think that's what will happen. And I can see this thing dragging on for years and years. That's the sad part of it, but I don't see any other alternative, because it really is such a fundamental question about the values of these people versus the values of civilised human beings.
A 24-year-old asylum seeker, Iranian Hamid Karzai, died of a septicemia from a cut on his foot, kept at Manus Island. Does this say anything about, raise any questions about our care of people in detention, Bruce?
Look, I think they do need to review these things. Obviously, when anyone dies, there has to be a coronial inquest or some form of proper review to see what happened. I'm sure the conditions in Manus are less than sanitary. I mean, it's New Guinea, for heaven's sake, and people die in New Guinea in great numbers because it is one of the unhealthiest countries in the world.
Michael, a lot is being made of how could he die of a cut in the foot. 4,000 Australians die each year of septicemia, but this has been put as something that's unusual.
Look, any death is tragic. Any death in custody is tragic. Perhaps our friend Gillian Triggs from the Australian Human Rights Commission can hold an inquiry into it soon after she's held an inquiry into the 1,200 people that drowned under the Labor government. She's never even inquired into. So, of course, this is tragic, but it is typical of the left, of the Greens, and sometimes Labor to want to make great hay in relation to something like this, where they didn't shed any tears over the 1,200 drowned at sea.
Michael Kroger, Bruce Hawker, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Coming
you.
up,